Hi. This lecture is about the Justin Willis article called Beer Used to Belong to Older Men, Drink and Authority Among the Nyakyusa of Tanzania. Let me go ahead and share my screen here because I've got a PowerPoint. Um, yeah, this is what the article looks like. Hopefully you have it. And what's Willis up to in this article? It's from 2001, so 20 years old. Um, he says this article examines changes in authority. So stop and think. Changes in authority. That has to do with the political system, but also with economics, also with kind of informal networks. So, what we're talking about here is really structural change. Um, and also, he says, this article is about drinking beer in Nyakyusa society. Hmm. And he's doing it from the 1890s, when written records became available, to the end of the 20th century. So he's covering roughly about 110 years of sociality and also looking at the authority structures and how they might have changed. It's important, I think, to with this article to examine how Willis's research is allowing us to talk about the process of social change. And obviously, here he's talking about one specific place. He's talking about Nyakyusa people who live down here in the southwest corner of Tanzania. This is Lake Nyasa here, that basically creates a border between Tanzania and Malawi. But also, you'll see some similarities here to the people that Willis is talking about with the folks from Zambia that we spoke about in the Grains from Grass book. And just like a few lectures ago when I talked about the kingdom of Mande, which is way up here, um, what we're going to be talking about in this article is how things used to be, and also, so like a kind of a snapshot of what we know from traditional ethnography that was done in the 1890s. And then um, fast forwarding to what we see today, which is obviously a world that is significantly changed. And what we're interested in here is how cultures maintain ideas. And what we're going to see here are particularly people maintain ideas about sociality. People maintain ideas about personhood, what it is to be a person, a good person in particular, but also the things that change. So a lot of times the things that will change are about like material culture that's available, the technologies that are available, but also sometimes ideologies. And one of the things that we see happening here is a real transformation in terms of how people think about intergenerational relationships. So the relationship between the young people and the old people has transformed. And also, what we see in this article is a real transformation in gender relations. So the relationships between men and women within a household have changed. That said, there's also things that stay the same. So that's what Willis is about in this article. Now, in order to do this work, remember, he says he's going all the way back to the 1890s. He's relying on a classic ethnography, which is by Monica Wilson. Monica Wilson is an ethnographer, an anthropologist from, I think she's from South Africa. And in 1951, she publishes her landmark book called Good Company. And it's a study of Nyakyusa age villages. Now, um, first, let's stop and take a look at Nyakyusa. So it's that same area that Willis goes to visit here in southwestern Tanzania. And then she's talking about age villages. Do you remember a few lectures ago when we were talking about social organization among the Mande? We mentioned that very often all the children that are born in a particular year, or maybe it's over a 2 year period, are grouped together into what's called an age grade, or in the word in Malenke is a tong. And those are young people who go through rites of passage together. And this is a really important feature because it's not just a kinship system, but rather it's a kinship of age mates, people who have things in common with you. And we've used the example before of like, when you went to high school, or even now at the university, there's people who started at the same time as you, and you're experiencing um, like rites of passage or rituals or significant moments at the same time. Like, for example, we've all just experienced this pandemic, and there are people who are experiencing it kind of similarly to you because maybe they were in college at the same time, and their college experience has been disrupted. And so that's something that you will share in common with other people who were enrolled in college at the same time as you. Or maybe your senior year got canceled because of the pandemic. um, that's something that you will now share in common with people at that same age, or close in age to you. One of the things that Monica Wilson is saying in this book is that for the Nyakusa, age mates are a significant source of um, support, and also a touchstone for identity. Yes, it's very important who you're related to um, by kinship, but also it's very important who are your peers. And so in this book, she looks at peer relationships, particularly among men. Although now look, she's a woman, so her access to a lot of this stuff is probably not the same as it would have been if a man had been doing this work. So she is South African. She was a research fellow at the International African Institute. You know what that was? Have we talked about that? Maybe we talked about it when we were talking about grains from grass. Uh, it's the today the International African Institute. It's also been known as the Rhodes Livingston Institute, and it's uh, frankly has a kind of a shady past because it has had a lot of interconnections with the colonial mission, the colonizing mission of the Brits. Um, but she conducted her fieldwork in Mwaya in the, you see here, the mid 30s, with her husband, who was also an anthropologist, Godfrey Wilson. So her research is taking place in the mid 30s, and so a lot of the data that she is collecting, and now look, she doesn't actually publish it until 1951. It can take a long time to publish. But she's collecting the data in the mid 30s, and she's also, while she's in the field, talking to people about their memories. So you might ask, well, why is Willis picking 1890 as the part of time where he's beginning his research? It's because this Rhodes Livingston Institute, this International African Institute, started up in the 1890s. And so when Monica Wilson goes to work at this institute, she has access to archives and data that has been collected in the 30 or 40 years prior to her arriving in the field. If you take more anthropology classes, we can talk a lot about how troubled the history of anthropology is. A lot of this access that anthropology has had historically to the field has been a result of colonialism. The Brits came in, and even before the Brits were there in Tanzania, the Germans were there. They come in with their own agenda. Usually they're there to export some kind of natural resource, So there is already um, a relationship of extraction happening. A lot of anthropology was done by potentially well meaning people who went to the field to study um, the people who lived there. And today, I think in anthropology, we try to think about ethnography in a little bit more of um, a way where there's actually a lot more um, potential for the host community, the indigenous people, to actually get some benefit from having an anthropologist in their community. Maybe the anthropologist acts as a interlocutor, speaks on behalf of the people to, like, let's say, powerful interests like mining companies or maybe government officials, or maybe sometimes the anthropologist in publishing work is drawing more attention to a crisis or an issue that the people themselves have identified and want to be acknowledged by a wider community. Uh, and even today, a lot of that stuff is real shaky. It's not always clear to what degree the anthropologist is an advocate for the people. Um, but certainly back when Monica Wilson was doing this work, those ideas might have been nascent. Um, and not to say that Monica Wilson and Godfrey Wilson were bad people, but the times were quite different when they were doing this work. And I don't know that there was a real sensitivity to the dynamics of power that really disadvantaged the people in their sample. Obviously, that is just the tip of an iceberg. That's a much larger conversation that we talk about in theory and that we talk about in action anthropology. Um, but I just want to give you the heads up. The, the data that Willis is drawing on was collected by outsiders over the course of, many decades. Now, Justin Willis was there in the field, presumably in the 1990s, and he's working in a very different kind of climate. But he does have access to this longitudinal data in the same way that Lisa Cliggett had access to longitudinal data when she wrote Grains from Grass. So I just always want us to be contextualizing where this data comes from and how it is itself embedded in these really troubling um, histories of power and exploitation and potentially violence. Now, one of the things that Wilson says in her book that Willis finds important for his article is that the Nyakusa villages are formed by groups of boys or men, all roughly the same age, together with the wives and young children of those who are married. So, what we're essentially talking about here is the formation of new villages. Remember when we talked a few lectures ago about the kingdom of Mande, and we said that these are really strictly patrilineal villages that are based on gerontocratic patrilineality. Gerontocratic patrilineality. Yikes. That's, rule by the oldest male, and all of your identity and all of your access to resources is coming to you through your father's line. Here we have something a little bit different. We have a region where there is ample land to be farmed, and we have, at least historically, Wilson tells us, going back into the 1890s, conditions that favor the possibilities of new villages being formed. And so if we get to a situation where there's a lot of young people who don't have access to the quality of resources that they believe that they should be, um, you know, able to access, um, they can band together and they can start up their own new village, and they bring their wives and their children with them. And there you go. They've got a new village that's being formed. And that's what she's writing about in here. these relatively new villages that have been formed within the last few generations. She says women belong to the villages of their husbands and young children to those of their fathers. So girls live at home until they're betrothed, after which they visit their husbands periodically, and soon after puberty, each joins her husband in his village. So the thing to think about here is how different marriage arrangements are. Um, the gender relationships are such that girls live at home with their father until the point when they're married, and then they go and they live with their husband. I mean, so far, really kind of seems like what we would expect in our own country, or at least traditionally or historically had happening here. But there is this thing where girls visit their husbands periodically, and soon after puberty, they join their husband in his village. So what we're taken to understand here is that the marital relationship actually stretches into childhood. So children are being betrothed. Now, the trick here is that it's not necessarily the case that girls are being sexually active with men, uh, because they're waiting until this period of puberty for her to become sexually active and to move in with her husband. But what I want you to think about here, given what Wilson shares with us, is that the structure of marriage and the structure of who lives in a village is very different from what we might have talked about before in the Kingdom of Mande. And it's also different from what we would have talked about here in our own culture. It's a different form of marriage that allows people to have multiple households that they could kind of simultaneously be drawing upon. Okay, now let's switch our attention to Willis, because this is Willis's big point in this article. Willis is saying that Wilson in this book is suggesting that when women begin to sell beer for cash, it plays a major role in altering the relationships between young people and old people, between men and women. And so what Willis is saying in this article is that beer lays at the heart of a pattern of social change. And that's why when he writes this article, he calls it Beer Used to Belong to Older Men, because what he's doing is he's setting us up to talk about these two different snapshots in the history that he's able to gather from Wilson's book, from colonial records, and then from what he observes while he's there. So that sets you up. That's the whole point of the article. So let's go ahead and dive in and look at it a little bit more closely. Basically, what we're going to be seeing here is that as the 20th century progresses, we see women gaining some economic autonomy that's separate from this relationship that they have with their husbands. And what we're also seeing is that the intergenerational relationship that formerly was very formal between young men and old men has started to be disrupted. And so the relationship between young men and old men has changed, and the relationship between men and women have changed. And this is due in large part to the market for beer. So let's take a look at how Willis does this. First of all, he tells us that the theory that he's using in this article is what's known as a theory of practice. If you have taken theory, or when you do take anthropological theory, you'll be introduced to a French anthropologist named Pierre Bourdieu. He wrote in the 60s and the 70s, even into the 80s. So just passed away not too long ago. He's a fairly contemporary theorist, and he is the one, that's whose theory Willis is using here. What Willis says he's doing in this article is that he's looking at how people drink, because when people come together to drink, they are coming together in social groups that are familiar to them. Like, who do people drink with? They drink with a group that's already been pre-shaped, pre-formed. And so what he says is that when he looks at the ways that people are drinking, he actually is able to glimpse how people order themselves. In other words, the people with whom people choose to drink is a kind of a structure. You would only drink with people that it would be appropriate to drink with. And there are probably people that it's inappropriate to drink with. I mean, if you think about this, it's a little bit the same in our own culture, that when you want to relax and be uninhibited with a group of people, the people that you choose to do that with are a select group of people with whom you have a high degree of trust. So these might be your friends, or maybe like your cousins, or maybe like your brothers and sisters, but a, a group of people that already reflects how you have chosen social relationships. And so in practice theory, what the anthropologist is doing is they're looking for moments in social life where people are assembling around them a group of people, or they're being relational in such a way that the anthropologist is able to discern some way that a person is organizing their world. So by looking at these groups of people that are coming together to drink, Willis is able to access very almost intimate, close to intimate ideas that might emerge. He says that the drinking moments show how people talk about drinking, including what's considered to be proper or appropriate behavior, and also how they are responding to social authority. Just stop for just a second and think about maybe some experiences that you have had. Are there ever times that you're aware that you and a group of people that you're hanging out with could potentially be busted by another group of people who think that what you're doing is like immoral or wrong, or maybe just inappropriate? Like, what if you're drinking with a group of people on like a Tuesday afternoon? Is there a presence in your life that's like, hey, it's Tuesday afternoon, it's not time to drink, drinking is for Saturday night? In other words, we all live in societies where there can be people who have more authority or more influence or more um, you know more of an ability to say what is right and wrong than we do. This is particularly true as we're young and as we're growing into our sense of self. You know, as we are learning the rules of the society and as we are exploring who we are as people, sometimes we take risks and we end up kind of pushing the edges of what might be considered proper behavior. This is what Willis is interested in. He wants to gather together with these groups of people, and he wants to take notes, and he wants to chat with people and visit with people and try to glimpse how it is that they're structuring the world. I mean, honestly, this is what ethnography tries to do anyway, but he stumbles into this kind of interesting way of being able to access groups of people who are drinking beer together. And he says one of the cultural phenomena among the Nyakusa is that these drinking groups are actually a big part of the culture. So much so that even our girl Monica Wilson has identified what's called ukwangala. It means good company. It's a Swahili word. And it means the convivial. Do you know that word? Like sort of joyful and give and take and alive, vibrant company that you feel when you're with people who are part of your age group and part of your same gender. And this is like a central piece of Nyakusa society. It's particularly true for men. So they get together with like basically like their buds, their dude bros, and they
are having some drinks and they are laughing and they are lowering their inhibitions. And this is called good company. And it's an important part of sociality for Nyakusa society. I mean, even going all the way back to the 1890s, that's what Monica Wilson's interested in. These are the group of people that, if they wanted to, would start their own new age village. And that's what she's trying to chronicle in her book. So Justin Willis is aware that all of this has been happening in the past, and he wants to look at what's happening today. Here's what Willis tells us. The separation between different generations that was inherent in the idea of good company, Ukwangala, was bound up with the idea that elder men held particular power over one another's well-being. Stop here. What about this idea of relational personhood? Can you understand what it might be like to be part of a social group where the well-being of the group actually impacts you? That's true sociality. That is communitas. That is what it means to belong to a group. Now, most of us in this class are American, and so we've been raised with a different kind of idea about what it is to have well-being. You know, for the most part, my well-being, at least the way that I understand it culturally, has to do with my own decisions, the decisions that I make, because I've been socially raised, culturally trained to think that my decisions impact my well-being, and they do. But what if we lived in a different kind of culture where the well-being that you had is part of a group of people, that your personhood or your wellness could be contingent on other people? So the idea that elder men have, that they have particular power over one another's well-being and over the health of their male and female juniors. So that is to say, if the olds are doing okay, then everybody's doing okay. The superior status of old men was marked by their exclusive access, this is historically, to millet beer. So, so what is millet beer? Well, it's beer made of millet. Do you know how you make beer? I mean, I don't actually know, but I have an idea. You take a grain, some kind of grain. I think for the most part, you know, if you're like an Anheuser-Busch person, it's probably barley and hops, right? And it's, you know, made into a mash. You take that grain, you smush it, smush it, smush it. You probably add water to it, and then you let it ferment. And in the process of fermentation, there's alcohol, something about sugars, something about chemistry. And then you add more water to it, and boom, you've got something you can drink. So it's this process of making a mash and allowing that mash to ferment, which takes time. And also, you know, of course, there's going to be recipes, like you can add different kinds of different percentages of this grain and this grain um, to actually, you know, impact the flavor. So some people are probably going to make more delicious beers than other people. Millet is a grain that you're probably familiar with if you ever buy birdseed. It's a it's very small, like a little roundy kernel. And in order to get that thing to ferment, first somebody's going to have to do the hard work of pounding the millet. So you're breaking the grain so that the outer shell is coming off, the husk, and then it's that little piece inside that needs to be fermented. So in order to make millet beer, first you'd need to grow the millet, then you'd need to harvest the millet, then you'd need to pound the millet, and then you would need to allow the millet to ferment into a beer. So it's a multi-staged process, and it's happening over time, and it's also involving the labor of a lot of people. Used to be, according to Wilson and her book, Good Company, that only older men had access to millet beer. Now, what do we mean here by older men? Well, these would be men who would be recognized by the society as having passed through a number of rites of passage so that they're at the end of their lives. And they're not just there alone, by the way, they're there with a community of people, men, that they have passed through all these rites of passage with. And they are thought to be the wisest, the most experienced, the most superior members of the society. And so they drink this millet beer when they come together. Willis tells us it's a lubricant of their social engagements with one another and an effective means of encouraging speaking out, which dispels dangerous resentments. Wow. What if one of the functions of coming together to drink is allowing oneself to say the thing that's hard to say? What if one of the functions of Ukwangala is for people, particularly men, to have a forum where if there's a conflict, they can speak the conflict, probably being a little bit drunk, but also recognizing that it's a safe space for them to work out any kind of conflicts that might be emerging. Now, it's important to note that at least historically, this space, this access to this safe space where people could talk out their resentments or talk out their problems is reserved for older men. And the idea that you would have here is that older men would be getting together, they would be drinking, they would be talking through the problems of the village, and they would be also posing solutions that don't just benefit them, but actually benefit the entire community. Because these men believe that they are responsible for their own well being and also for the well being of their entire community. Now, let's add a little bit more historical stuff. During the colonial period, and like I've already mentioned, the colonial period in this part of Africa begins in the 1890s. A lot of men in Nyakusa land are being lured away from the region to work in mines. This is particularly true for this part of Africa. There's a lot of copper and there's a lot of silver. And so obviously the colonial authorities, mostly going to be British, German, Dutch, they know that. They know that there's wealth in these mines. And so they are employing local men to work in the mines. They're luring the men to the mines with the promise of cash. So cash starts to appear in significant ways in the 1890s. Now, remember several lectures ago when we talked about Great Zimbabwe and when we talked about Kiwa Kisawani and we talked about these internal trade routes? Absolutely true that the African people of this region have already been embedded in these huge economic networks. But what's happening here is that the cash is actually being backed by a colonial power. And so it's a different form of cash. It's also the first time that Nyakusa men are being asked to trade their labor for wage. And they're being compensated for the labor that they do. Can we be fair? They're being undercompensated for the labor that they do because Karl Marx would tell us that everybody's undercompensated for the labor that they do. But it's a transformation in the way that the economy is being conducted. What do these men, okay, let's also talk about who's going to be a good migrant. Who's an ideal migrant? Is an ideal migrant a guy with 6 wives? I mean, possibly, but in general, the people who are the most desirable as migrant laborers are the younger men, the men who have the kind of vitality and strength to work in these mines, which, let's not kid ourselves, this is hard, dangerous work, And one of the things these men do with the wages that they accumulate is they go back home and they think, what would I really like now that I'm home? These are young men. Now remember, in the age village structure, it's this group of men who are kind of a set of peers who have set up the village. And they are those men who are older and older and older as time passes are the ones who are in charge of all the authority. They have all the political power, they have all the economic power. We've also learned, hey, I'm going to scroll back, so hold your head, that historically there was this gradual experience of marriage where a young girl was promised in marriage by her father to one of his age mates, Ukwangala. And over time, she grows into that marriage. And she doesn't just get married and go to this guy's village, but or his household, but rather it's this experience between two men who have made this arrangement and promised each other their daughters in marriage. That's not, but in order to get that bride, you need to be friends with her dad. Do you see how if there's this migrant labor thing and these young guys are leaving, they don't have access to brides yet? Oh, but what if they come back to the village and they're awash in all this cash? What if they could use that cash to trade with somebody's daddy to get a bride, essentially to jump the line? The young men have gone away, and rather than coming back and being like, I got to wait till I'm an old guy and I have Ukwangala with my age mates, rather they're able to buy in to the marriage market, and they're able to be like, hey, you know what, I'm going to give you cash in exchange for reproductive access to your daughter. Look, I know I'm not making marriage sound very sexy at all. Like one of the reasons that people want to marry is to continue a lineage. And one of the reasons that people want to take wives is because wives are not just about sex, but they're also about um, managing your household and helping with the agricultural labor and helping with the number of people. And also, we've talked about this before, in relational personhood, the more people, the better. So one of the things that begins in the colonial period that ends up being truly disruptive for Monica Wilson's book is that young men come back and they can go ahead and they can basically arrange marriages for themselves. They no longer need to go through these Ukwangala systems, but rather they can just go directly to somebody and propose a marriage and take a bride. The other thing that we learn in Willis's article is that the way that the beer is brewed changes. On the left there, that's that millet that I was talking about, which you might recognize as birdseed. Although, you know, lots of people around the world rely on millet as a staple grain. It's actually delicious. Millet porridge is really good. It's got kind of like a nutty flavor. It's kind of like a really healthy tasting version of like kind of like an oatmeal kind of flavor. Although oats are obviously very different from millet. But what we learn is that the villages during this period of colonialism start to minimize the millet that they grow in favor of maize or corn. So you see there on the right, the corn. If you had to crush these up and pound them to make a mash, which one is more time efficient for you? One of the advantages of corn is you don't have to pound it. It's soft enough that you can go ahead and you can turn it into a mash without having to remove an external husk. I mean, all you really have to do is peel off that the green outside, and boom, now you have access to your grains. A lot more time efficient. It's also gives you more mass, right? They're bigger grains. Now, yeah, the truth is corn requires a lot more water to grow. So there is a sunk cost involved in growing corn. But the entire agricultural profile of Nyakusa land has been changing during this colonial period. New crops have been introduced, including maize, and we've got this new kind of economic thing happening. I'm trying to find in the article the actual line that she says in here about the changing in crops. Oh, bum, bum, bum. Well, I will get you to find it for me. I'm going to take up too much time. She said, and then continued to take more time. Actually, he introduces that information pretty early. So the nature of the beer is changing. Hey, and we've already talked about beer in Grains from Grass. Willis says this is ultimately what ends up happening as a result, in part because of the cash economy that gets introduced, and also in part because of the transformations in the agricultural labor, that there's a new imperative to individual accumulation. And that new imperative is undermining the commitment to generosity between age mates, Ukungwala, and at the same time, the population's growing and there's new economic importance of standing tree crops like tea and coffee. So these would not probably be consumed locally. These are being consumed as cash, or these are being grown as cash crops and exported. So what we see is that a former pattern of economic integration is being undermined by this new economic system where we've got cash crops in the forms of tea and coffee, and that's ending the pattern of generationally shifting settlement, which made predictable the strict separation of fathers and sons. Fathers and sons now can be living in the same village, or the sons could be absent, but then coming back to the villages of their fathers. And in many ways, because they're bringing that cash back, the power, the economic clout of the younger generation is equal to or greater than the pre-existing generation. And so what you see is old people getting displaced by young people in very new ways. In the end, Willis is really saying that what has emerged out of the era of colonialism is a real disruption to what previously existed. The concept of Ukwangala has been subsumed by a reliance on cash crops and cash wages. And that because it's young men who have access to these things, they have come home and they have disrupted the pre-existing social order. And it's not only the young men who have been disrupting the pre-existing social order, it's also women, because it used to be that women made these millet beers for the exclusive use of old men. But now there's a market for beer. People want to drink beer. Young people want to drink beer. Women want to drink beer. And so the women who formerly only brewed this beer as part of a ritual drink are now making it for everyday use. So beer has lost its symbolic meaning, and beer has become commodified. It's become something that every single person has access to. The last part of the article, uh, Willis talks about what's left is that this section is called Drinking and Authority in the 1990s. And he says more than any other way, what he sees is that there's been the emergence of this generational conflict and also the absence of that mechanism that used to exist in the traditional society where old men could come together and sit down and get drunk and hash out problems. Old men, first of all, don't really have that kind of authority anymore. And also, even if they did, the young people wouldn't necessarily listen to what they had to say. Says, while grand public rituals, uh, this is on page 385, in which the chiefs played a role have largely disappeared, their demise assured by the hostility of the Christian denominations to which most of the populace belongs. There are constant smaller events which evoke and remake assumptions about the power of older men and the danger posed by their unexpressed resentment. So, one of the things that we learn is that this young man came back from a period abroad where he had been working, and he does not invest in a funeral rite in the way that the community believes he should. He's taking the money that he should have spent on the funeral and he's blowing it on something else. And the whole community's judging this. They're like, hey, that is wrong. That's bad. And Willis takes this as evidence of this kind of generational conflict. He says, rituals like funerals used to be places where people came together to enact their common ideology. And what's happening here is that the common ideology is in danger. It's breaking down. One thing that I didn't really mention earlier is that there has been this increased presence of Christianity and lots of people converting to Christianity, and some of them believing that drinking is immoral. So, we're gonna talk more about religion in a different lecture. One of the things I just want to leave you with as we kind of close out of this article is think about this category that we have in our culture of the teenager, and think about how interesting teenagers are. They're in between the category of child and the category of adult. And in our culture, teenagers have a lot of clout. They have a lot of impact on the way that we organize entertainment and popular culture. I mean, they are a market. But think about culturally how interesting it is to have this group of people who are not economically independent, yet who drive markets. I'm just going to leave you with that idea to sit and think about in terms of our own culture, because one of the things that is happening across Africa, one of the big conflicts that happens internally in African culture is how rapidly social change is happening and how disorienting that is for people. Within just a few generations, you're getting this complete upside down way of structuring authority, economic autonomy, gender identity, marriage, notions about personhood, notions about wealth, notions about work. All of these things are transforming very, very quickly. And it is disruptive. It's disorienting, and it can feel like chaos to people. So I'll leave you with these ideas, and I'll see you in the next lecture that you tune into. Hey, don't forget to contact me if you have any questions or if you can't access something. Bye.